What was the first job you ever had?
The first job I ever had was sweeping floors in my father's factory. That was the first job I had. And let's see, how old was I? Probably about 15. And he paid me minimum wage. At the time was $1.25 an hour. So what I didn't know, of course, when he handed me the push broom, big wide push broom, was that there is an actual technique to pushing a broom, where you push a little bit and then you kind of hit the broom on the floor, which releases the dust that gets picked up, and then you keep on pushing. My father's factory was so dusty. One of the things he manufactured a couple of different things that had to do with wall covering adhesives. So he had this powder that, went into these bags, and then you had to heat the edges of the bags to close the bags up. So the powder was it was everywhere. I didn't like working there. I liked hanging out with my dad, of course, because he was a fun guy, but the factory, it was just so dusty. So I worked there whenever that was, probably that summer, and then when I was 16, and I worked for him, like on the weekends, so like on Saturday. So the deal was that I either had to go to Temple on Saturday, or I had to go to work in the factory. Now, the thing about working on the factory on Saturday was you started at, I don't know, whatever it was, 8 o'clock in the morning, and 12 o'clock you were done. So it was just like a half a day. Of course, when you're 15, 16, 17 years old, 4 hours is like an eternity. So I dislike going to Temple so much that I would rather go to work in this dusty old factory. Yeah, that would. And then when I was in high school, that fall, I wanted a part-time job. I wanted to make more money. I walked into this place called Hub Auto on one of the main drags in Boston, Commonwealth Avenue, and it was like the epicenter of automobile racing enthusiasm. I mean, they had every part imaginable. Guys hanging out there that owned dragsters and hot rods, and it was this really cool place. I walk in there.
What year is this?
This is fall 1963. So I walk in there, and the guy says, "Do you know anything about working in a warehouse?" Oh, yeah, I did, because I worked at my dad's warehouse, and I knew all about old stock has to go in the front, new stock has to go in the back. Knew all about that. Guy says, "Okay, you got a job, kid." Sends me in the back, and then in the back there were a bunch of what seemed to me a bunch of old guys sitting around, not doing anything, just hanging out. I get in there, and of course, they give me a clipboard and tell me that I have to start doing inventory. Well, that's what they were supposed to be doing. So now they get the kid doing inventory. So this lasts for about, I don't know, maybe a month, after school. But I have like weird hours. I can't work all the regular after school hours because I have all these other things. I have baseball, and I have music lessons on every Wednesday in town. So I'd go in there, and then I don't know, about a month later, I'm about to walk in the back, and the manager says, "Oh, wait a minute." He says, "You got a driver's license, right?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, I need you to make some deliveries." Oh, okay. So I have a list because I get the clipboard back, get the list. They start putting stuff in the delivery truck, and then all these old guys in the warehouse, now they're all pissed off at me because I'm just like this punk that gets to drive all over the city, and I don't have to work in the warehouse anymore.
Why'd they pick you for that and not these other degenerates?
Probably
because they knew they were degenerates.
They probably figured the guys in the back were a bunch of drunks, or they didn't want to, it was a van, a company van, and maybe they were nervous about those guys driving or whatever.
To set the scene, this is Boston.
This is Boston. And this went on for a while, but of course I wasn't particularly, my hours weren't very dependable. And they wanted me to work more hours, but I couldn't. I had other stuff going. I had practice. Oh, and I had the band orchestra. So I'd go in there and I'd show up like at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and work for 2 hours. The place closed at 6, and then I'd go home, drive home. So anyway, that lasted for a while. Hub Auto. Anyway, didn't work there very long. They didn't like my schedule very much. So.
And what kind of car were you driving home?
A 1953 Chevy. I paid $80 for it.
Oh
I paid
man.
$80 for it, and let me tell you, it had when I bought it, it had 40,000 miles on it, and 40,000 miles in those days on a car was like 250,000 miles on a car today. I mean, cars today 100 times better. But it was, it was all mine, and I loved it, and definitely not a chick magnet car, but it was.
You got from point A
But
to
it
point
was,
B.
yeah, exactly. So summertime, again, I would work for Dad, and I did gigs. I was playing music on the weekends. I started doing that when I was maybe probably just turned 15. I had a band. Can't remember how I got hooked up with them. There were guys that lived close by in the next town,
And you were a drummer.
and I was a drummer. And I remember that whenever we practiced at my parents' house, we practiced in the basement because the house was kind of built on a bit of a hillside. The basement had just like went right out into the backyard, and it had a big window there. And whenever we would practice there, all the kids in the neighborhood would all be there looking through the window, and it would always be like this group of kids whenever we started playing. And of course, we were really terrible. For a time, we only played instrumental music because that was a big thing on the radio. Nobody sang. I didn't even know that I could sing. And then we eventually we got this guy in the band. He was a singer. He was kind of a wild guy. But before that, the first gig we did was at the Temple on Sunday. Now, Sunday, they had this kind of entertainment in the vestry. There was a stage. It's like a big rec room. The name of the band was the Satans. Okay, so that's Satans. And my dad, as I'm about to pack my stuff up, and had one of these things on the bass drum that said Satan, the Satans. My dad goes, it may not be the most genius idea you ever had to show up at the Temple. He says, all you've got to do is change the A to an I, and just for at least one day be the Satins. So those were fun days, and those were days where I didn't really know anything about drumming techniques, and just, I could sight read, and I knew a lot of basic stuff. I've been taking drum lessons since I was 8 years old, but none of it pertained to rock and roll. You had to kind of figure all that out yourself. You really were trained in the direction of jazz, even the way you held sticks. I learned how to hold match grip like that, but you first taught this kind of parade drum style like that, and that's how all jazz drummers played. And certainly how Buddy Rich played, and some of the best drummers ever. But playing rock and roll and having to hit really hard, it wasn't really the best. Technique. So I made money playing music, not much. You'd make $5 a night. Did a lot of record hops and stuff. Get hired by local disc jockeys, and when you really got paid the big bucks, you made $5. That
The
was
whole band?
Yeah, and that band, there were only three of us, and not even a bass player. There were two guitars and drums. But believe it or not, you could still get gigs. And I remember this gig that we did. I wasn't even old enough to drive yet, and so we did this gig at a fraternity, a Boston University fraternity, and there were all these older women. These girls, they were like 18, 19, 20 years old. They weren't as old as my mother was, but it seemed like they almost were. And it was funny because you being in the band, you did catch some attention, which I thought was kind of cool. And I'm not sure how much thought that I had put into the connection between being a drummer and getting girls. Maybe being a drummer and getting attention, but I think that much that I was actually going to get girls from playing drums. That was great. Not that I got any college girls at the time, but anyway. But they were friendly to me,
This is at a time before rock and roll is rock and roll. I mean, there's Buddy Holly and there's Elvis, But today we don't consider that rock. I mean, we consider that like, you know, the Mount Rushmore and like the Pilgrims of rock, but like we think of like Led Zeppelin and the Beatles. But yeah, so I mean, what was that like in 1962, 1963?
So let's take 1962 and 1963 as an example. I mean, there was rock and roll. I mean, there was Little Richard. There were a lot of rock and roll, screaming rock and roll. But it wasn't the same kind of soul music that the a cappella groups sang. The street, you know, 4 or 5 guys out on the street singing harmony and stuff. I mean, that was a lot more searchy and a lot more soul music, although I don't think we called it soul music then. But then, you know, guys like, you know, Little Richard and Chuck Berry, Bill Haley and the Comets. I mean, it was called rock and roll. And I'll tell you a funny thing. When Rock Around the Clock came on the radio, the first time I heard it, I was in my dad's car. For whatever reason, he was driving me to school. What grade am I in? I don't know. I'm like in the 3rd, 4th, 5th grade or something like that. And Rock Around the Clock comes on the radio, and why he was listening to a station that would even play that, I have no idea, because he liked standards, you know. And as we're driving up the street, my dad goes, you know, that's rock and roll. And I mean, I can't remember what my reaction was, but I mean, looking back in retrospect, I thought, wow, that was kind of an interesting thing for my dad to say, that he pointed out rock and roll to a kid that, you know, grew up for a time in his life making money playing rock and roll. So, you know, rock and roll, yeah, right, Led Zeppelin, rockers for sure. But the term rock and roll had been around for a long time. Supposedly,
Really?
Alan Freed said he coined the term rock and roll. Rocking and rolling with a girl meant you were having sex with her. And that's
You're
where
right.
rock and roll.
Alan Freed, perhaps best known for coining the phrase rock and roll, DJ/show promoter. Alan Freed played an important role in the development for the newly emerging genre. Wow.
Right. So, you know, Alan was, you know, a disc jockey and you know, associated with the record business, and which got some of them in trouble, by the way, at a certain point. But and how he made this connection between the expression and moving that into a musical genre, who knows where that happened? I mean, that's like, you know, when did early man stand up and start walking? I mean, you know, it was like, I'm not sure that anybody really has an answer to that. But most of the music at the time that I was playing, because nobody in the band sang, were all these instrumentals. I mean, there was like Santo and Johnny, a song called Sleepwalk, and there was another song called Rumble, and there was the surf bands, early surf bands in the early 1960s that were playing, you know, songs like Miserlou. I mean, there were all these instrumental songs on the radio. You could actually be a band, at least at that point in time. They could get away with only playing instrumental. So then around maybe early fall 1963, I'm a senior in high school, and I got hooked up with a bunch of guys in Lexington. And 2 of these guys could sing harmony like you can't believe. I mean, they could sing like brothers, of course, being, you know, 13, 14, 15 years old, 16, whatever. Yeah. You know, your voice could really blend, especially if you knew how to sing. Didn't necessarily mean you were a great singer, but you knew how to sing. And if you had a good ear, you could sing harmony. And these guys could really sing harmony. I remember going to Scott's house. Scott was the leader of the band, and his parents' house was in Lexington. And I come in, and the first thing they say to me, it was like a split-level house, I remember. Playroom in the basement where all the music was made. But then upstairs, in the living room, and scattered on this coffee table were a bunch of records. So they say to me, check those records out. What do you think? So what's there? The 4 Freshmen, the most incredible harmonizers, and the Beach Boys, and other records of groups that sang harmony. And then, of course, there was there were, a bunch of rock albums. They had a list of whatever the popular tunes of the time were, and the Beatles were just about to come out. So we go downstairs, start play some music, and can't remember what songs they were singing, but their harmony was amazing. It was really good. At one point, why we rehearsed at my parents' house, I don't know. But anyway, so we had a rehearsal there. And after the rehearsal, my mother says to me, those guys can really sing and play. Those guys, I have to tell you, they're much better than that other band that we were playing with, the instrumental band. And then right around, I don't know, maybe October. So now this is September. Now October, or late October, right around there, the Beatles' first album comes out. I can't tell you how many kids must have had an epiphany at the same time. If you were a musician or you wanted to be a musician, this was the music you wanted to play. And then the Rolling Stones, and then all the other British bands. And I mean, it was this constant music just coming on the radio that, you'd never really heard this kind of style of music with all these harmonies and rock and roll. I mean, it wasn't like Bobby Vinton anymore. And before that, even the rock stations didn't really have enough rock and roll to fill up 24 hours a day. So, they'd mix up Patti Page, Perry Como. It was like this mix. But now the radio stations were starting to primarily play rock and roll music. So now everything is rock and roll all the time. You turn on, certain stations. And Boston had a station called WMEX, and they're playing rock all the time. But they only played rock until 10 o'clock at night, and then they had this talk show. It's really funny. But the Beatles, that was musically speaking, it was a life-changing experience. I remember when She Loves You came out, I was with a bunch of buddies, cruising somewhere, and She Loves You starts playing, and everyone in the car goes insane. Everybody in the car is just like, oh my God, oh, it's the Beatles. They're so incredible. I mean, it was like, that's how things work. That's how exciting it was. And honestly, of all the music that I have loved over the years, I don't think that I ever had the kind of elation ever the way that I had when I heard all this Beatles music, especially through the years. And every time a new Beatles album was coming out, man, it was like Jesus was about to speak, I mean, that's the way that it felt like such a special moment, a new Beatles album. Wow. So that was a pretty cool time, and it was, musically very inspirational. And we did some great gigs. I mean, I went off to school. I managed to still play with these guys over the summers. I told you at the time that I got to play drums for the original Ronettes. We were by the way, the name of this band, we call ourselves the Pied Pipers. Why were we the Pied Pipers? You heard this story. You haven't heard the story?
I mean, maybe. I can't remember.
All right. So there were a bunch of disc jockeys from WBZ, WMEX. They had record hops all over the Boston area and beyond.
What's a record hop?
A record hop was when you just spun records. You took your DJ program on the road and played it to a bunch of kids in a gigantic ball. And it could have been 500 or 1,000 kids. These old ballrooms that big bands used to play in. The ballrooms were still around, but now they use them for rock concerts and stuff. So anyway, they would spin records. Oftentimes they were up on a stage and they're just spinning records. And then at some point, the live band would come out and play a set. You play like an hour set, and they give you gas money. And so we used to get calls all the time, and we did like 1 million record hops. So originally the band was called the Cavaliers. One day we're sitting around, and one of the guys says, we follow so and so around, meaning this disc jockey and his girlfriend. He was this married guy, and he was carrying out this other woman who had been in the record business for a lot of years. All we do, we follow them around and we get paid gas money and, we need to make more money. And one of the guys said, yeah, it just, they're like a bunch of Pied Pipers that we just follow along, And one guy says, yeah, we should call ourselves the Pied Pipers. And I said, yeah, it's better than calling ourselves the Rats. Although if we were a punk band, it would have been a great name. And we did a million gigs. And anyway, so we were opening for the Ronettes, so John Hancock Hall in Boston. It was a big deal. We go for the early sound check, and they hire a drummer from the union, and he's just like old guy, and he doesn't know anything about the way the drums were supposed to sound with the Ronettes. And that was all the records were made by Hal Blaine, one of the greatest rock studio drummers that ever lived. Phil Spector sound, and this guy doesn't know anything about it. But I was a big fan of him. He was such a great drummer. All the drummers knew him and listened to him. And I walked up to whoever their handler was, and I said, I can cut that gig. I know every Ronette song ever made. Now, what year is this? Maybe this is 1965 or something. They said, okay, we'll try you out. So they tried me out with Be My Baby. Bum, 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 bum. Gave me the gig. Signed the old guy on, and that was my first time as a real rock and roll star. Well, that actually lasted more than 15 minutes. It lasted about 45 minutes. And then I had to play with the Pied Pipers. First I had to open playing a whole set with them. Then I played with the Ronettes. But that was a fun thing. We opened for a lot of different bands, famous bands at the time. It was just so much fun. Why would I ever want to stop doing it?
What was your most famous moment? Your most famous feeling moment in your whole... Because how many years did you play music professionally?
15 years.
Okay, so in those 15 years, what was the number one where you walked off and you're just like, we are gods? Like, what was the top most famous moment you ever felt?
Okay, so... Now, that's a really interesting question because, I had played with bands that had big hit records, but that wasn't my most... that moment, that kind of moment that you're talking about. So I was dating this girl. We're hanging out at her house, and she goes, "Well, what are you going to do with your life?" I'm playing music, playing music all the time. I mean, making money in clubs, and I'm still very much a kid. It's just, what are you going to do with your life? And I said, well, I'm going to be a rock star. And she rolls her eyes and she says, are you kidding me? She says, that's ridiculous. You are never going to be a rock star. And I said, well, you never know. So that pretty much did it for me with her, right? So maybe I don't know how much time goes by, but not long, maybe a couple of weeks go by. I had been playing with this band in Cambridge, and we had just opened for Cream at the psychedelic supermarket. And
for Eric Clapton and Cream.
Yes, Eric Clapton and Cream. It was great, just great fun. And at some point, the band kind of guys are sort of wanting to go in different directions, and I thought, yeah, I guess I'm done with them. So I go into a music store that was called E.U. Wurlitzer in Boston. Boston was in some respects, kind of a small town, big city, but really small town compared to places like New York. Didn't have many music stores. They had a few. So I go into Wurlitzer, which was kind of the epicenter of where musicians would hang out. A friend of mine, another musician that I knew, he says, hey, what are you doing? I said, I think I'm going to leave this other band. And I said, I'm really looking for something else. He goes, he says, did you ever hear of Ultimate Spinach? I said, oh, yeah. I said, the whole town's talking about that band. And he says, well, you know what? He says, they're looking for a drummer. So I think I paid the guy $5 because I think he was kind of running this music musicians connection thing. And I go next door.
That's the original
barber.
Facebook page.
Exactly. So I go next door to the barbershop. Now I have long hair. Go to the barbershop because there's a payphone there. Of course, now they're rousing me and they're yelling and just kind of messing with me.
To cut your hair.
Because of my hair. All in fun. In a barbershop yet, right? Because it's the only payphone around nearby. So I call up and Ray Perrette answers. You met Ray, my old manager. And Ray, he says, yeah, we're auditioning drummers for Ultimate Spinach. He says, come on down. So pack my stuff, go down, audition, get the gig, start rehearsing. And then they had a drummer. They already had one album out. They hadn't gone on tour yet, but the drummer was married and didn't want to go on tour. And so that's why they were looking for another drummer. The first gig that I did with them was at the Boston Tea Party. Now, the Boston Tea Party, that was the number one place for bands to play, and not just local bands. They had, you name it, they played there. Led Zeppelin, I mean, every famous band you could imagine at the time, or almost, because not the Rolling Stones and not the Beatles. But every other
Boston
band.
Tea Party was a club?
It was a nightclub. It was, believe it or not, it was originally a synagogue, and it was up on the second floor. It was this giant room, and they had like a psychedelic light show, huge stage. It was a big deal to play there. I mean, a really big deal for anybody to play there, never mind local bands. And they always had local bands on the bill with big bands. So now we're going to play at the Boston Tea Party. Wow. I mean, that blew my mind. So we do the gig at the Boston Tea Party. Right as the last song ends, and the place is packed. I get off my drums and I see the girl who I had been dating. And she's down there. And so I hop off the stage and I said, I told you I was going to be a fucking rock and roll star. And she goes, well, I'm sorry. You're right.
Oh, that's, wow. Oof.
That, I have to say, that was one of those moments, where, your ego gets overfed.
Yeah, you're all hyped up after the show. You're like, that's right.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, that was a pretty funny moment.
So you're working for yourself.
Well, yeah.
You have a boss?
Yeah, you have a boss. There's always a band leader, usually the person that put the band together. A lot of bands, it's sort of like an input of ideas by a group where, maybe there is a band leader, the guy that started the band, he kind of has the last word on who gets hired, who gets fired. But oftentimes, the music is you just do your own thing. He's not telling you what to play. But when I started playing in show bands, now that was different. That was about as close to being in the military as you could be. And still be a rock musician. Because they had specific parts that they would want you to play. Everything was very carefully arranged. You went and you did a rock gig in a tuxedo. And when I was playing in show bands, I had 6 tuxedo outfits. One was a tuxedo jumpsuit, if you could imagine such a thing. And then I had other tuxedos of different colors. I had a powder blue tuxedo. I had a red tuxedo, and that was part of the show band thing. And I worked for some tough guys over the years, and I don't know. It was pretty much. I can't ever remember being asked to do a lick that I couldn't play. And a lot of these arrangers, although I could sight read music because I had a background where I had learned to read music from the time I was like a really little kid, but they very rarely had any kind of charts. And if they did, they were just like a bunch of block chords that really pertained, more to, guitar and bass or keyboards. But oftentimes there were certain licks that they would want you to do, just a way to keep time in a particular signature. And for whatever reason, I could always do it. Whatever they asked me to do, I could do it without, stressing out about it. And it was just all part of the gig. And they had band sets and they had show sets. They would have 3 band sets, and then they would have 2 show sets. You play 5 sets a night, 6 nights a week. You played 5 45s.
That's 5 45-minute sessions.
That's right. And you're playing full out every song except the slow songs. But there were a lot, because they want to keep people dancing. The more you dance, the more you drink. There was this whole thing about playing a lot of fast songs. Most human beings would be totally worn out, at the end of the night. But I was still standing. But I was a kid. I was just a young guy. And
what kept you going?
I just
was it just to show up that girl?
Yeah, I know. I only had to do that one time. That was the end of that. But no, I just liked doing it. There was a certain euphoric experience that whenever I played music, and there were certain songs that just move me, inspire me. It just how it was. It didn't matter that it was such hard work, but also the pay was good, and a lot of these guys were married and had kids and had homes, and some of them had little side gigs where they were selling crap out of their trunks and
like what? Drugs?
This one group that I played with, Survivors LTD, was to give you an example. In between shows, the whole band would be sitting around at the bar, and the rowdiest guys in the room were the band. Me excluded, some of these guys were the most rough and tumble guys. One of them, the guitar player, he was a Hell's Angel. Yeah, he was just a really rough and tumble guy.
Was that the band where can you tell the story of the guy who's like, he made off with the money?
Oh, yeah. Okay, so that was Survivors LTD. The leader of the band at the time, his name was Dario. Now, Dario was a very talented guy in a lot of ways. He would get hired by outside bands to put shows together, which is how I met Dario in the first place, because I was playing in this other show band, and he came in and he put this big show together. It was called the Australians. And there were 2 girls and 5 band members. The 2 girls, they came out and they did these shows, and they were amazing. They could sing, they could dance. It's amazing how much talent there really is out there that nobody will ever know about. I know I'm kind of digressing here, but along the way, I saw people that were so incredibly talented that nobody would ever hear of. So anyway, that's how I met Dario. So he'd come in and he'd tell you, you got to do this lick, tell the horns what horn lines to play. He had all this stuff in his head, could not read a note of music.
Wow.
He knew show bands, and he knew how to put a show together. And he was a maniac. He would yell and scream. Not that you were doing anything wrong. That's just, it was his style. So, of course, everybody is scared shitless of Dario, But he was a nutcase in some ways. So anyway, we're in Buffalo, New York, in the middle of the winter. I quit the band right there on the spot at the end of the gig. The guy that was managing the band was a guy I didn't like. The guy didn't like the way he operated. And before I even got into my car, I had packed my stuff up, went up and told him, we're done. And he goes, well, what are you going to do? And I said, doesn't matter, we're done. Well, I'll pay you more money. Doesn't matter, we're done. Get in the car, drive back to Boston. A couple of days go by. Now I'm out of a gig, but I'm not even looking for a gig, not yet. I just feel like I need to take a little breath from this band because we're on the road all the time. So a couple of days go by, and I got a call from Dario. Why is he calling me? He goes, Survivors LTD, we're looking for a new drummer, and you got the job if you want it. Didn't even have to audition. And I said, yeah, I'll take the job. And it paid way more than this other band played. Because Survivors LTD, they were one of the top show band of Boston. So, sorry about that. My hearing aid. So, yeah, sounds great. Okay, so then I start gigging with Survivors Ltd. and we're playing all over different places in the country. We do a job in Memphis, and after the gig, I don't know, there was like a break of really only a few days. We had this home base job. One of the guy's cousin owned this gigantic nightclub in Fitchburg, which was, I don't know, maybe 45 minutes from my house. His cousin's name was Bobby Fusco. Bobby was a really nice, very nice guy, but he was a no-nonsense guy. If he ever got like a speeding ticket, he knew all the stadies. How he got this nightclub, and it was a beautiful, beautiful nightclub. I have no idea how he did it, but maybe selling alcohol, he did it. Maybe he had a bar. I don't know. But Bobby was also a really tough guy, very tough guy, but a good guy. He had this office, probably the size of our kitchen living room put together. And in the office, he had this rolled and pleated leather edged bar that went in kind of a sort of a L shape, a J shape, big long bar. This is his office. You can imagine a kind of partying that he used to do in this office. Anyway, I get this phone call from one of the guys in the band and says, what are you doing? I said, well, I'm just, taking a couple of days off before we start up again at the club in Fitchburg. He says, well, we need you right now. You need to come to Bobby's club, and you need to come right now. I go, what do you mean? What's going on? And he says, it doesn't matter. Just get your ass over there. All right. So I get in the car and I go to Bobby's club, and the band, all these guys, 5-piece horn section, all lined up at the bar, and they're all drinking. Everybody has a little glass of something. Right in the middle is an empty bar stool.
It's like the scene from The Departed where he calls everyone in.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it was kind of, I walk in, I see everybody sitting there, I see the empty bar stool, and Richie turns around and looks at me and he goes, over here, right here. Okay, so I go and I sit down and I'm thinking, well, are they going to off me? Did they think that I did something wrong and and I'm going to end up, cement shoes on? I mean, I didn't know, no idea. I told you, these guys were, kind of a rough bunch, but great musicians, really, really good musicians. And a fun bunch of guys. I really did like them anyway. But they could be scary too. So Richie, the bass player, and he and I were pretty friendly. He reaches into his pocket and he has a little snub-nosed Saturday Night Special, and he puts it down on the bar. And he says, Dario split with the money. That's the bad news. The good news is you're going to get paid. Oh, that's nice to know that I'm going to get paid. Dario split with the money. Okay, so we've got two questions to ask you. Is you Dario's drummer, or are you going to stick with us? Well, I had no idea. Dario was a fucking psychopath anyway. And I said, no, I love you guys. I love you guys. And I am going to stick with you guys through thick and thin, hell and high water. Whatever you say, I'm with you guys. And there's this 6-shooter on the bar. And then he puts it down like right in front of me. A gun? What the fuck? Right? Now here's a funny thing. In those days, it was against the law to even own a handgun in Massachusetts unless you were somehow associated with law enforcement, or you were a private detective and had a special license to carry a gun. If you got caught with a gun back then, it would automatic prison sentence of a year if you didn't have the license for it. These guys thought nothing about that. And I remember looking at that gun, and I remember thinking, wow, you really got to have balls to have a gun, because eventually the NRA got that law shot down. But that law did exist for a long time. But anyway, so then the other thing is, he says, also, we want you to take care of all the money. And I said, what do you mean? He says, we want you to collect the money from the club owners from now on. We want you to take care of it. We want you to pay the band. We want you to be in charge of the money. And I said, well, why me? And Richie looks at me and he goes, because you're the Jew.
Oh, man. Oh.
So I did. For as long as I was in that band, I did take care of the money. And damn well bet I was very careful of how I accounted for every nickel and dime.
Last question, 20 seconds to answer.
Go.
What do you want to be when you grow up?
I want to be probably retired.
That's the real correct answer. Yes. Hey, man, we did it. I'm going to call you on the phone, all right?
All right. Love you.
Love you. Bye.